All right, well, I'll get started because I have a good amount of content here and I want to make sure to cover it all. So to introduce myself, my name is Guillermo Olivos. I'm the Assistant Director of the Center for Social Value Creation over at the Smith School of Business. My center concentrates on social impact, on sustainability, and triple bottom line approaches to business. And we have a close partnership with MTech. We do advising on specifically their Citron Prize related to the upcoming Maryland Business Plan competition. In addition, we also run our own No Limits social pitch competition. So the purpose of this workshop to be delivered here at the Engineering School is to give those in this part of the community some basic tools and skills to understand how you might frame entrepreneurship in a way that not only makes a profit for yourself, but also has a positive impact on society and on the environment. So within this lecture, I'm going to give an overview on just what triple bottom line approaches amount to when it comes to entrepreneurship, and then I'm going to do a brief dive into 4 specific areas of a business model in which you might be able to think about ways to frame your approach with social impact in mind. So just to start, I'm sure everybody in here has some sort of vested interest in entrepreneurship, whether as an entrepreneur yourself or a student of the subject or maybe a switching professional. Everybody comes from somewhere, but from the Oxford English Dictionary definition of entrepreneur, it's very basic. Somebody who sets up a business taking on financial risks in hope of profit. So, everybody knows who this is, right? Anybody?
Henry Ford.
It's Henry Ford. And you got your Sam Walton and then your Mark Zuckerberg. So, across, over 100 years of entrepreneurs, these 3 guys have looked at an issue, an opportunity, and designed a product or a model around that opportunity and ended up, really changing the world and making a lot of profit. So profit, not to get too economics-y on you in engineering school, but it's revenue minus costs. So it's a pretty simple equation. To maximize one's profit as an entrepreneur, you either want to maximize your revenue or minimize your costs, or ideally do both. I'm not going to get into marginal cost curves or average cost curves, but it's a pretty basic. If you do everything right, you make a lot of money, and everything is hunky-dory. So the triple bottom line approach to entrepreneurship, and I think more critically, what success is for an entrepreneur, amounts to metrics in the end. Looking at how much money you make is a very simple way to categorize value of a venture or value of an organization that you're running. Triple bottom line refers to having not only the bottom line of maximizing your profit, but also a bottom line of maximizing your value to society or the people around you, and also the value to the planet that we live on and to the environment. So economic considerations, of course, are a basic tenet of entrepreneurship, particularly in a for-profit model. You can't get away from that. But there are certainly ways to think about the choices that you're making as a manager and as a business leader and as somebody bringing a product to market that might, in addition to making you money, also have these positive ramifications on these other facets in this Venn diagram. And that sweet spot in the middle is this phrase that gets thrown around a lot known as sustainability. So, a perfectly sustainable venture, in theory, would be one that's not only delivering value, in a profit-maximizing way, so you can continue doing the good things that your organization is doing, but is also, scaling out its positive impacts on society and the environment. So just a very basic concepts that I'd like everyone to keep in mind when thinking about this new way to look at entrepreneurship. It's profit maximization while benefiting society. But I have to capitalize right there. It's not charity and it's not bad business practice. I don't think making a bunch of money as an entrepreneur and sort of donating it is what we're getting at. We're getting at ways to make money while simultaneously having a positive impact on society. It's not bad business practice. It's not just, funneling money in a way that you wouldn't do if you weren't concentrating on these things. It's more about looking at opportunities in different facets of your business model to not only accelerate your business forward, but also have these positive impacts. And it is grounded in strategy. So I'm going to dive into 4 different ways to frame these options and these possibilities, and we'll watch some brief videos with some examples of social entrepreneurs that are doing this, and we'll do a Q&A and a sort of workshop-y session on what we think about it. But first I'd like to get into human capital, which is just a fancy way of saying employees, the people that you hire to make your products, or the people that you hire to help you run your business. So going back to that basic business approach of profit equals revenues minus costs, the best way to get the most value out of your employees would, in theory, be to hire as few people as possible for as little as possible to make as much as possible. So when you think about wages and the amount of money that you pay a specific employee that's working for you, often education is a proxy for how much money you pay somebody. That's why, those of you that are university students are in university, and those of you that have gone through education have invested in that. As you get more education, your wage in theory gets higher. So your education is a proxy for the skills that you have, and wage, in theory, as you pay an employee, more or less, is a proxy for how many skills that employee brings to the board. But, at times, there are opportunities, not necessarily arbitrage opportunities. Arbitrage is a word in financial markets that is used to describe situations where things aren't priced appropriately and one might make money off of it. But when looking at employees, I like to think of sort of a sports approach. You think about somebody like Jeremy Lin, and does everyone know who the person on the right is? Alfred Morris. Alfred Morris, the 7th-round draft pick, who ended up being, I think, 4th in the NFL, 2nd. So a top dog, and certainly when his contract renewal comes around, we'll have to discuss that again. But great examples of return on investment for human capital. So those are sports metaphor that only get too businessy and sports metaphor on you guys. But at the same time, there are other options for hiring decisions that people make that can actually have benefit for your business on an annual basis. Tax credits, for example, for hiring individuals from certain populations. There's a lot of emphasis in the markets right now on veterans coming back from Iraq. There are other specific tax credit opportunities for disenfranchised populations where if you hire a certain type of employee that meets a certain demographic that's in need, you can actually get a kickback when you're closing your books out at the end of the year. But there are lots of oh, here we go. Okay, so thinking about these employees that we might hire and where those opportunities might lie, I think the goal in relating the sports metaphor I use to how you might hire somebody in a business is thinking about populations that maybe are priced inadequately from a business perspective. So employees that maybe have a skill set that is going to deliver you more value, but for some reason society in general, and assigning them a wage or assigning them a potential for higher ability is not pricing correctly in terms of how one might think of it. So I'm going to turn on this brief video about a social enterprise in Los Angeles, and it's about 7 minutes, and then we'll discuss afterwards.
Yo, mic check. 1, 2. Homeboy Industries is the largest gang intervention program in the U.S. of A, I suppose in the world. And so it's like a rehab center that helps folks who want to, gang members who want to redirect their lives. It's not a program for those who need help, it's only for those who want it. So we're here ready with it, ready and willing.
See shit, I love about the same man I got these with. Hey yo, it's all heartfelt, although maybe sometimes I didn't like the way.
Now there are 5 businesses: Homeboy Bakery, Homeboy Silkscreen, Homeboy Homegirl Merchandise, Homegirl Cafe, and Homeboy Maintenance. This place raises the question, what if we were to invest in these people rather than just endlessly seeking to incarcerate our way out of this problem? So that's the idea.
That's right. Why don't you let me just pick my prime no more? I'm just telling you what you can't find.
Now we have about 400 plus that are working for Homeboy Industries, which is a good opportunity. That it's a want, not a need. And like I said, majority of us right here we're in want of a job. We're in want of an opportunity that now we're able to show. And given that opportunity, look at what we can do.
In Brown Town talking about
We're employees working in the bakery. Most of them are fresh out of jail or trying to get out of jail and get their lives on track. We have men and women in the bakery. We have about 5 different accounts. This is our biggest account. We love we service 9 of the 11 cafes on campus, and it's going really, really well.
We do papers, College G, and ever since then I've been out for a year. If it wasn't for Prospect, I've been on the streets, selling, shopping. We went.
You gotta talk about you. You'll see that too, you don't need to take it. I don't see it. This one.
Yeah, I'm kind of overwhelmed that I'm driving the bakery, they're not paying. You got different sets here, but we work as a family, as a team,
Like me, I have black people in
A lot of neighborhoods are treating my property. Being poor, being raised by a single mother, my kids, I'm out there living in the housing project. Pretty much self-explanatory. Struggle. You don't really have no choice in life.
It's real hard. Like me, I'm a single mother. I don't have a baby father, and he's right. So it was hard for me to step up, but we have to do it. You know what I mean?
A miracle.
Homeboy Industries to me is like a family.
She seems it feels hopeless. All I needed was a chance.
You reach out to the voices that can't be spoken for, You reach out to such a lot of good others. But hope is something that you know what? Like a dream, what? If you don't want to be speaking my property, it's kind of hard to do that. Excelling in academics.
It's been the blessing that had my life all written down. Maybe I could die peacefully. But you listen, I live. Wherever you go, you carry peace in me. And everything I said, I meant it. But it was inspirational with some deceit shit. I love about the same hat I got these with. And yo, it's all heartfelt. Although maybe sometimes I didn't like the way it was dealt. So I say to them that you can live in light shelter.
Okay, let's see. Is this working? Okay. Yeah, you can't look at the answers yet. Okay, so Homeboy Industries was started by Father Greg Boyle in Los Angeles in the 1990s. And the purpose of this enterprise was to take formerly incarcerated individuals, mostly gang members, and specifically make the decision to hire them into jobs with fair wages, making cakes or, manufacturing or maintenance, excuse me, t-shirts. So there's some risk in this model. So put yourself in the shoes of, just somebody that's trying to start some conglomerate, that a bakery and a maintenance shop, or, a clothing design place. And, think about the decisions that Father Boyle was making, and I just sort of wanted to ask your guys' opinion of maybe what you see some of the economic advantages or disadvantages are of this model of hiring reformed convicts, as well as the social advantages and disadvantages, because I think you can make arguments for both sides, and I think that's going through that sort of brainstorming is the social entrepreneur's onus, because there's always going to be trade-offs in the decisions you make, particularly when it comes to impact-driven metrics beyond the economics. So, does anybody have any thoughts on this model? Yeah, sure.
In my opinion, because there's a high population of incarcerated people, there are always going to be people who want to change and want to come to the program.
Right. So they were throwing some of the statistics at us about the prisons versus the universities, and there are always going to be, individuals coming out of the prison system that do want opportunities like that. So you have lower risk in your supply. Yeah.
I would say disadvantage is you don't really know their work ethic, because you don't really have anything to go off of as far as like a resume.
That's true. I mean, but couldn't you say that might be a disadvantage for hiring anybody? I mean, I feel like coming out of the prison system, you don't have a traditional resume, but maybe you have like a work study, or maybe, you have something you were doing before you went to prison. So I think there's some trade-offs on that one. But for sure, you'd have less information. Yeah.
Low wages.
Low wages?
I guess for the employees, because they are not going to probably find a job anywhere else. So they're looking desperately. So.
Right. So, perhaps, wage equality, of course aside, well, not aside, but as a given, but, for these individuals that can't find jobs in other places, or would probably have a tougher time finding jobs in other places, you might be able to hire them for a little bit less as a manager, but still at a rate above, what they would be making on the other hand, or a rate that, is above minimum wage. So that's a good point. Any other thoughts? We've been talking about economics. We haven't really dived into the social. Like, what are the societal advantages or disadvantages of approaching it in this way?
You're helping somebody to re-enter society in a positive way.
Right.
You're also going to be putting more energy into training.
Right. And so maybe that's a disadvantage economically, though. I mean, how much more time are you going to have to spend training an employee coming back into society versus somebody that maybe is more used to the job market? So. What was that?
It costs a fortune to incarcerate somebody.
It does cost a fortune to incarcerate somebody. They're throwing some of the statistics at us. So if you think of benefit to society, cost to society of incarceration. Now, as an individual entrepreneur in the society, you're probably not thinking of it in these ways, but if that's something that's important to you in terms of the values of what you deem as success in your venture, then sure, for society it costs a lot less to have somebody as an active tax-paying member of your society than, sitting in prison for and costing society $30,000 a year. So I'll just review some of the things that I thought of, particularly getting back to the tax credits. So there's a number of federal subsidies that relate to hiring individuals that fit a particular demographic. One of those demographics being recently incarcerated, on parole, on probation, and that exists at the state level as well. And whether, I know Maryland had a tax subsidy, I'm not sure if they renewed it for this year. I know they had one last year, but there's opportunities as a manager for that. They didn't go into this in the video. There's no way you would have known it, but Father Boyle works with the prisons in the Los Angeles region in California to try to tap into the training programs that the prisoners coming out are able to access. And so that decreases his cost to train on the ground because he's able to already do some training on the cheap in the prison system. So that's another opportunity. Disadvantages, we touched on this a little bit, but in the end, you have to look at employees, or excuse me, you have to look at your customers. You have to look at people that are going to come and buy your cakes or hire maintenance workers from your company and defend the fact that all of your employees are former convicts and, convince them that this is, a safe venture. As a manager, you don't know that much about their history. Is your employee going to leave suddenly? Or are they going to suddenly decide that they can make more money making decisions that maybe they made in their past, as opposed to entering society as a employee of your business? And then of course job mobility limitations. There are certain things that if they're on someone's criminal record, they're just not going to be able to do. So you have to think about that as well. If you're running a bank or a daycare or things like that, they're just sort of options that are closed. But, at the same time, consider what you're doing for society. You're providing jobs, you're increasing the tax base, you're hiring grateful workers. Now, I think an important thing we didn't really talk about is company culture. Let's say you have a business where you don't have, individuals in this particular demographic, and now you're starting a movement to bring in people that are maybe cut from a different cloth. You're probably going to have to invest in your employee relations and make sure that the company culture stays intact if you're making a decision to all of a sudden, sort of change the demographic of who is working there. And, that's a minor point, but at the same time, you have to think about the employees you have existing, particularly if you're shifting into a model like this. But, at the same time, these human capital opportunities are all over the place, and it's not just for, formerly incarcerated individuals. You have, individuals with disabilities, veterans, places that are putting emphasis on fair trade and employees and local economies getting fair wages, and we'll get into more of that in a second. But, there are ways to really think about your hiring process as a manager and tap into having a greater impact than you might normally have just putting your job postings on LinkedIn or on Idealist even or whatnot if you think about it strategically. So does anyone have any questions on human capital as it relates to social entrepreneurship? Okay, great. So the second thing I wanted to talk about is supply chain, which is a word that encompasses many, many things. Does everyone know what supply chain means? Kind of from a basic perspective, sort of you're producing a product, it comes from raw materials, it goes through all these different steps before it eventually lands at the consumer. So think about coffee. It starts in the ground, and then it gets processed at an intermediary place. Then it gets manufactured and packaged, and it gets shipped. Then it goes to Starbucks, and then you drink it. So there's sort of a lot of different things happening along the way. And as happens so from an engineering perspective, as you introduce more variables into a supply chain, you probably increase your entropy. You have less control over what's going on a regular basis. So there are opportunities to be a more fastidious manager depending on the state of your business or who you're hiring or who is supplying your services or your goods to keep social impact in mind. And some companies do that in a better way than others. But as we've seen in the last 20 years, some companies have failed to do that and have really seen major repercussions when it comes to their stock prices or the way that they're viewed from individuals' perspectives. Nike had that huge sweatshop scandal in the late 80s, early 90s. Mattel in 2004 had the lead-based Dora the Explorers from China, and their stocks plummeted. Nestle actually had this palm oil scandal about 5 years ago, where it turned out that some of the ingredients in their Kit Kat bars are being taken from trees in this region of Madagascar where this particular endangered orangutan was. And then finally, everyone, I think, is probably remembers the Foxconn scandal from the last couple of years. Actually, I heard on NPR this morning that Foxconn is actively going forward with like a labor union initiative, and they're going to be having like a sort of, they're setting up a labor union, and which is not always heard of, I think, with Chinese companies. So they're moving in a good direction on that. But basically, you know, just 4 different situations where I think if you ask the CEO of Nestle, or if you ask Steve Jobs at the time, or, you know, the CEOs of Nike or Mattel, nobody would say they wanted this to happen. Nobody would say that they, like, you know, knew that they could get cheaper toys if they had lead in them, or, you know, cheaper sweatshirts if they had sweatshops. But because they didn't have a watchful eye on all of the parts of, you know, the pieces of the supply chain that added up to their product, it came back to bite them in the end. And as your business grows and develops, that's going to become a greater and greater risk. So so supply chain, thinking through these, you know, basic, you know, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, I think there's specific buzzwords that tend to come up with those nodes. Supplier, for example, you think about Chipotle. Chipotle puts so much emphasis in the media on like free range and on, you know, non-genetically altered animals and things like that, and they, you know, derive benefit from that in their marketing. Other companies don't do that, and so there's an example of somebody aware of the social impact of where they're getting their animals. Manufacturing, clean chemicals, and fair labor. Distribution channels, you know, transportation, outflows into the atmosphere in terms of smoke versus, you know, using greener fuels. That's been a major shift in the way that people approach their distribution channels in the last 15 years, last 20 years. And then with warehousing, just thinking about the basics behind the partnerships that you create. And that facet might apply a bit stronger to somebody in a smaller startup stage of things. You know, when you're starting a business, you have an opportunity to make some very initial partnerships and some very initial sort of relationships with people that, you know, in the story of your business, once you guys all become as big as Apple, you'll go back to and be like, you know, he was my first supplier, or he was my first, you know, partner. Are the values that you want in your business accurately reflected in those partnerships and those relationships? Because, you know, those early years are opportunities to really think about that in a way that you might not be able to when you're somewhere down the line and your business is that much bigger. So we're going to look at a example of an enterprise that made some supply chain changes, and then do a discussion after that.
At the core of the relationship model is really connecting the people in the supply chain. And when I was working in Mexico, as I was starting out my coffee career, I saw firsthand how many farmers were not connected to the places where they sold the coffee. They had very little idea about what happened to their coffee, how it was processed, how to taste it, what the prices were. There was just a lack of transparency. And I set out to try to change that supply chain system to provide more transparency. In the process, I realized that those farmers could get trained in tasting and could get trained in producing better exports and all kinds of other areas. So it became clear I needed to put people on the ground who had local knowledge, who could work with those farmers throughout the year, and that's why we started doing our job. When we started having operations at stores, that was a departure from how the industry usually looked at overseas operations. Most of the time,
importers and exporting companies would put up their own mills and mill coffee of small growers, export their coffee. How could they learn to taste their coffee? So it was this idea that we would reinvest back into the education and training of growers that was a departure from where things were before. We recognized early on the power of having farmers train other farmers in best practices, whether it was organic productivity or taste or how to operate mills. And over the years, we found that's one of the best tools is simply taking outstanding experts from one coffee region and bringing them to another coffee region and having them share their knowledge. With the success of the Mexico office in 2002, we did a couple of things that were noteworthy. We put people down there, roasters had immediate access, and what happened is our business started to grow. And 4 years later, we needed more coffee, and Mexico was going to be stretched if they had to also do South America. After a number of trips, we realized we had to set up a new shop. There were a couple of great people that wanted to join us, and we decided that Peru, as one of the largest suppliers of organic and fair trade coffee in the world, would be the right place to do it. Starting the origin offices and realizing that tasting the coffee is really one of the key components of successful commerce for the growers, we also brought the ability of taste and expert tasting into our company and did it at a level that's really unprecedented in the industry. And that's helped us go to our roasters and really be able to pick exactly what the tastes are that they're looking for and translate those to the growers. And we also get the growers certified as expert tasters so that then we have one unified chain of people tasting coffee so they can deliver exactly the right coffees to the right customers. Africa represents an incredible opportunity for all coffee roasters and drinkers because of the myriad of choices and flavors that come out of Africa. Ethiopia is the cradle of coffee. There are tens of thousands of varieties there. So having an office in Africa made a lot of sense because Africa is also beset by some of the most difficult supply chain problems that you'll find anywhere in the world. Usually the places where we can make the most impact are the areas where transparency has not been strong, where traceability is difficult, where there are many, many layers of middlemen in between the growers and the roasters. And by putting an origin office in place, we started one in Tanzania, we're able to change that dynamic and provide a whole new way of operation for growers there. And we see immediate results, and it expands the amount of money that goes into those communities. When I think about the origin offices as a catalyst for the community, I get very excited because the idea that you can have a place that serves as a way for the village growers to connect to other networks of nutrition, of education, of finance, of health. Those are all kinds of issues that are important to the growers and ultimately important to us as coffee buyers because the quality of life has a huge impact on the quality of the product.
Okay, so how many of you guys have any sort of background knowledge on the coffee industry or fair labor or anything in that vein? Even the most rudimentary of... So, what was that?
Just consume and drinking coffee.
Oh. Well, the issues that this organization was just driving at and describing their decision to put these origin offices in these countries has to do with a lack of information along the supply chain. When it comes to fair labor and coffee, or fair labor and really anything that's produced in mass someplace that's far away, oftentimes because of the transactional costs that come from, a farmer bringing his goods to a local market and then somebody taking those goods to a port and then someone taking those goods from the port to the country, and just all these different nodes along the way, the further you are from understanding the actual value of what you're selling, the more likely it can be that perhaps you're not getting paid a fair wage. So with, making this decision that David Griswold made to, sort of accordion in the supply chain, so to speak, and to bring, his people to country and then bring the farmers also to this intermediary office, I think there's a couple of advantages, not just wage-based, but also quality-based, that one can derive out of, making that decision. So does anyone have any thoughts in the same sort of, looking at this from 3 different standpoints: economic, social, and I didn't include environmental in the human capital, but I think there are certainly some environmental advantages to this coffee question here as well. So origin offices for this coffee company, bringing farmers closer to the process, teaching them more about coffee. Any other thoughts? So this ominous buzzing.
He said himself that he realized right away that his own profits went up.
Mm-hmm.
At least I think profits went up. So that's obviously economic advantage to right away the feedback to that model.
Did he say why they went up?
I don't know if he did.
So I don't think he did either. He alluded to some things that happened, or that were happening with his business model as a result of making this decision. So does anybody remember? Yeah.
Well, I think they said that they had them taste the coffee and make sure that it was actually good before they send it out.
Mm-hmm.
If they know the people that they're going to send it out to, they can communicate better with them about, okay, the product is good. So maybe the product became better, more people wanted to buy it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, think about this. You're a farmer and you grow coffee beans. And then before you grew coffee beans, they looked okay to you, you put them in a bag and set them up. Now they're getting extra information as the producers of this good on, how a bean might look versus how it tastes. And then they can take that information back to the farm and then make better agricultural decisions as a result. The way things are happening before you integrated the supply chain in this way, that wasn't an option. And as a result, that lack of information was resulting in an inefficiency along the supply chain of the business model. So absolutely.
Related to that, it's not a general question, but my son's having worked in a different industry. Is there's less attention paid to quality than there is obviously bottom line? I'm sure we're going to get to that eventually.
Right.
And I found that for 8 years I was with a big corporation, they outsourced more and more. So there were more levels of outsiders.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lack of accountability, but I think for the business as an organization, their bottom line cost was reduced. And I always worried about the quality, and it just didn't seem to be addressed. So maybe this is evolving with certain organizations more than others, but it's a simpler example when we talk about the taste and quality of coffee. But maybe they're laughing because we work more in the life sciences, and that industry is all about outsourcing right now. So I don't know if you're going to.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a perfectly valid point, and I think it's much easier framed in something like consumer packaged goods than biotech or things like that. But simultaneously, I do think at a certain point in the growth of any given company, if there's something happening along the supply chain that is reducing, quality or becoming a safety issue or things like that, that does eventually get scrutinized and brought to public, whether it's Nestle or whether it's cheap plastics or cheap airline screws even. We've seen that in the last 30, 40 years with the air industry. So,
I agree, because I used to feel like I want to jump up and down when all that people focused on were these more quantitative metrics, and I felt like the quality was lost because it was harder to measure.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the whole business world was doing, finding ways to precise everything, but the bottom line it translated to cost.
And I think from a business model perspective, you have to look at how everything works together in the system. So if you're concentrating on quality, you're likely going to have a higher price point. If you have that higher price point, you're going to have to think about a luxury consumer as opposed to maybe a basic consumer. And then, maybe down the line, it depends on the product, of course, it depends on the market, but down the line, once you have some built-up capital, then diversify downstream and, find some product that meets in the middle for a certain person with, a level of purchasing power. But it is an easier example for, I think, the level I want this lecture to be, to concentrate with CPG. So just to go through some of the things that we did cover, but also some that we didn't. So operations at the source reduces that middleman margin hike. You're taking one more person that would tack on another 10% out of the equation. But you're investing in building these origin factories in these countries. So that's going to take some upfront capital. You know, also paying a fair wage means, for better or worse, I think for better, you have a more expensive end product because those extra costs in paying that wage need to travel down the line somewhere. I mean, you either kind of eat them or you price up a little bit. I think it's likely that in the long term you will have to price up. So like I was alluding to earlier, you would need to account for that by marketing to the appropriate consumers. Social, you know, the quality of life has a huge impact on the quality of your product. You know, it sounds kind of laissez-faire. Well, not laissez-faire. It sounds, you know, kind of flotsam. But, you know, happy workers tend to produce better products. This is not something that I can throw a scientific study at you to prove, but, you know, I think it's an adage that has served well in the world of business and thinking about, you know, how to make a product. Disadvantages. Advantages maybe for the entire economic system, but maybe a disadvantage for particular individuals. You are streamlining the process. You are theoretically eliminating jobs, those same jobs of the middlemen, but, you know, maybe that means that they can work in some more effective, more efficient for the entire economy, you know, job, especially if you're streamlining the process, you know, sort of eliminating the need for them. Environmental, I like that we talked about this for a second. Closer relationships with the growers, I think, means less risk. I mean, if I am selling coffee and making promises about its quality and, you know, the equity of my wages and all of these things, and that's part of the value of my brand as a social enterprise, I want to make sure I can stand behind that so I don't end up like Nestle and I don't end up like Apple with Foxconn. Like, I would like to know my farmers. I would like to know the head farmer on, you know, that plantation that is coming down to my origin factory. More oversight of the growing process. I think developing those relationships up and down your supply chain. And so, you know, I mentioned relationships earlier. I think relationships is so crucial when you're building a business. Just know who you're working with. You know that your farmer is not using illegal pesticides or is not, you know, doing something that is going to make you look like a liar as the person at the front end of the supply chain, like facing the consumers and facing the market. And then more direct transport. And I don't think there are really any significant environmental disadvantages. But I did want to take a second in the supply chain section to talk about this term greenwashing. Has anybody ever heard that term before? Greenwashing? Okay, so greenwashing, everyone's heard the term green though, right? Okay, so what does green mean? More environmental friendly? Like, how though? Like, I mean, what is green? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, solar power versus petroleum, sure. And what I'm trying to drive at is, I think this definition of green, well, first of all, green is everywhere right now, but second of all, green is relative. So with that relativity, it's like a blessing and a curse, because what does green actually mean? I like this cartoon. I think it drives at what I'm trying to get at. How do I know your company is environmentally friendly? Because of the wording and the typeface and the pictures of nature in the brochure. But at the same time, you know, if you're in the business of a sustainable product or something that you're going to try to pitch as green, I think it is hypercritical in this marketplace to come up with, in the least, your own definition of what green means and something that you can stand by and defend. Because, you know, if you get out there and, you know, you're saying this is green or that is green, and, you know, people will question you on it or, you know, put you up against your competitors, you need to not just use words that have different definitions without understanding what you're pitching. And I just think it's so, everything is so green right now. It's like where there's a green revolution, but it's everywhere and nobody knows what it is. I mean, you look at sustainability metrics, environmental certifications, not only at a national level, but at an international level, there's dozens and dozens of them. And nobody has really made a decision on an international basis on what is, you know, the umbrella, this is green, this is not green, you know, this is sustainable, this is not sustainable. So there's nothing you can do about it as a business owner or as an entrepreneur, except, you know, really write down very early on what green is going to be to you if you're pitching something as green. And then just, I had this graphic in here. Make sure you pay attention to your suppliers because you don't want to end up like the entire toy industry after that lead thing. It was very ugly. Are there any other questions about supply chain? Okay. Let's see. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is consumer targets or your customers. So, you know, maybe I should pause here and hear a little bit more about the kinds of, I mean, I heard what some of you guys are working on, what you're interested in. I wasn't able to hear, are you an entrepreneur, sir? What sector, what sort of things are you interested in?
I'm testing the certification of electronics.
Certification of electronics? Okay, so I'd imagine with electronics, there's a lot of supply chain facets to that. Anybody else working on anything or want to talk about something that they're specifically interested in? Just, okay, that's fine. I just wanted to stop and ask because I don't want to feel like I'm talking at you, and hopefully this is interesting and relevant information. And I, yeah.
Can I ask a question on the supply chain?
Yeah.
I went to a farm, a cocoa coffee farm in Ecuador, and you want the farmers to have good wages, and you want the quality of the product to be good. And if you're an American using a farm in Ecuador, it may be good for that small population, that small farm, what you're doing, but how does it impact on the rest of the country there? And does that matter to you as a socially conscious entrepreneur?
Is this a rhetorical question, or are you asking me specifically?
Well, I mean, you were talking about the benefits to the company, but I don't think you really addressed how you weigh the benefits for the company and the country of origin.
Right. So I think that delves into this deeper issue that I alluded to earlier of certifications and standards, particularly in coffee. So coffee is very much a part of this fair trade, fair labor movement. And even with some of my colleagues that work in fair labor and fair trade, they've talked to me about these different sort of certification factions, some of whom are more stringent in terms of this is a good company because the farms like do, you know, X, Y, and Z. And then there's a rival certification group that's a little more lax that says, oh, well, as long as they have this checkbox and this checkbox, we'll give them like a fair trade stamp of approval. Don't quote me on fair trade versus like the names of these programs. I can't remember specifically. But I think when it comes into changing the aggregate landscape of how a country does business, maybe if there's like labor standards aren't up to par, that's much more of a political and sort of public-private partnerships question. As the consumer, I would only say that if that is something that's important to you, I think the best thing you can do is make sure that the companies that you're buying from reflect your values as a consumer, and that you would spread, you know, that word. I'm sorry if that doesn't answer your question, but can you elaborate? Is it?
You know, you go to some out of the way places, and you're pleased that you can pay a price that isn't going to kill the guy, that's going to give them a fair value for what they have. But I think of products like quinoa, or even I mean, quinoa is something that is a staple for many countries that is now so expensive that the people that need it aren't being able to get it. Whereas chocolate is more of a niche product that that if they want to sell it to the high-end hotels and not feed their people chocolate, that's really okay. So I mean, when you're talking about being socially conscious, I was just curious if you had a statement on preventing something like what happened with quinoa.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Do you understand what I'm saying?
a bit. So I was in northern Thailand like 3 weeks ago, and so I'm trying to sort of draw and while I was there, I worked with a social enterprise that, you know, is focused on sustainable tourism and making sure that, you know, people that are taking tours of the hill tribes of the Golden Triangle region are you know, concentrating on paying equitably back into these villages as opposed to, you know, sort of taking advantage of them. And it's one small social enterprise working in a part of Thailand that hardly anybody ever goes to, but it's, you know, making a difference in that community. And over the last 10, 15 years, through its practices, it's been able to garnish attention from Lonely Planet, garnish attention from like even the Thai government, and sort of, you know, draw more eyes towards things that are happening with companies that aren't operating in that way. And, you know, it's kind of like a grassrootsy answer to your question, but at the same time, I think when it comes to changing societies, it's got to sort of start with, you know, the first movers, the first players. And I don't want to dive too deep into that rabbit hole because I could, but I want to make sure that we stay on topic with sort of like top level building blocks. But I do think individual social entrepreneurs are a critical part of fostering social change on a macro scale. So that aside, in terms of consumers and customers, so I wanted to make sure that anyone that attending this lecture got to hear a bit about microfinance. Everyone loves microfinance, and, you know, it's a buzzword. Does everyone understand on a basic level what microfinance is? Okay, we'll dive into it. I'm going to talk through the story of one of the first microfinanciers. In fact, you know, arguably the man that invented microfinance. So the basic concepts is extending small loans to extremely impoverished people in a very low income bracket, to allow them to generate income and care for themselves and their families. So when you go to a bank, when you go to a traditional bank and you ask for, you sort of look at like how they structure their loans. Like I go into Chase, I'm like, I want some money. Chase reaches, you know, many individuals, and if they're going to give me some money, they rely on these standardized statistics and metrics to determine my loan risk. In other words, my credit rating. You know, what does my borrowing history look like? What, you know, and then maybe some other things in their formula. How old am I? You know, I'm not even really sure how all those formulas work. But what I'm trying to drive at is there is a formula to it. And I think a bank like Chase or Wells Fargo, or, you know, even in another country, you know, national banks and countries, they don't necessarily have as many mechanisms for non-traditional clients beyond high interest rates and high monthly payments. So I come in, I don't have a credit history, but I swear I am a very good borrower. And they're like, that's great. Here's your, you know, 20% interest rate, or, you know, not that crazy, but obviously something high. So for a traditional consumer that's borrowing money, if that accesses your monthly payment and that accesses your credit score, what do you think the graph's going to look like? Something like that, probably, right? Something descending. If I have my credit score is 400, you better believe my monthly payment's going to be pretty high. If it's 800, it's a little lower. But by and large, this is the relationship. I fulfill these different things that a traditional bank uses to determine how risky I am, and they assign me a monthly payment. So now let's think about a consumer that has a credit score that's really bad. This part of the graph represents a level of monthly payment that is just too high for people with that credit score. So that's like money that in their formula they're never going to be able to capture. It's just, you know, it's just the populations that have the bad credit scores that aren't there. But if you think about it, what if the credit scores aren't actually the best proxy for how risky I am? If that's the case, and you could offer a lower monthly payment for people that otherwise would fall into this space, if you had increased information about their riskiness, then maybe the banks could make a little bit of money. Maybe you could have some sort of relationship where you made that monthly payment. But you would need that increased information to figure out who these people are that in your standard system, your formula would say, don't lend this guy money. Like, I don't, you know, he just doesn't qualify. So the idea of microfinance networks has everything to do with risk and everything to do with kind of the basics behind how monthly payments and interest rates and things work. Basically, it is predicated on this idea that if you had more information about how risky an individual consumer was, so how likely it is that somebody's going to pay you back if you lend them money, if you had additional information for people that don't really exist in this traditional bank system, maybe you could lend them money with that additional information and actually make back a little bit of interest on it, while at the same time giving them a loan that they can use to, you know, better their lives or invest in a business or whatnot. So these microfinance networks, which started in Bangladesh, and I'll tell a bit more of that story in a second. Basically what they did is they went out into villages where people just couldn't borrow money unless they were very, very rich. And they found local microfinance institutions, literally like storekeeper shops in villages, like the people that were sort of the bankers of the villages, and said, you have more information on Joe and Sally and Sue, obviously not their names, but you know, of the people of the village and how, you know, reliable they are than we do. Can you be this intermediary to do these individualized assessments based on how your society works or how sort of this community works, and, you know, make decisions on lending and get that information for us? From there, they started doing these things called Grameen loans, where they would lend, and when I'm talking about lending money, I'm talking about between like $50 and like $200, like micro loans, not that much money. And they found over the course of the life of the Grameen Foundation, which I'll talk about in a second, that the default rate was lower than on higher education loans and credit cards in traditional systems, which is kind of says a lot to what, you know, Chase over here might say is an absolutely crazy idea and we should never, you know, ever do it. So I'm just going to show you another video on the positive effects that Grameen loans had on Southeast Asia as they were recovering from a natural disaster, and how this... Oh, you can do it? Okay, thanks. I'm taking a long. Grameen Foundation, though, they're like big time in social enterprise, so definitely somebody to know about.
The 2004 tsunami was one of the deadliest natural disasters on record. Aceh, Indonesia was the hardest hit. More than 200,000 people died or were reported missing, and 500,000 were left homeless. In the year following the disaster, unemployment in Aceh increased nearly 400%, and more than half the population was living in poverty.
Adik itu nggak tahu kemana. Sampai sekarang mama dua-dua, mama mertua, mama saya nggak ada. Kakak sampai sekarang nggak tahu di mana kuburan orang tuh.
In response to the disaster, the Indonesian government, together with international aid organizations, quickly mobilized, providing emergency food, shelter, and medical care to the survivors.
Kami duit nggak ada sedih kali waktu hari itu. Kami ingin kali biar ada modal usaha, biar anak kami bisa sekolah.
Based on its 12 years of experience in microfinance, Grameen Foundation recognized that long-term recovery depends. Grameen Foundation provides funding for microloans and technical support to these institutions, allowing them to reach more poor people more effectively.
We as an organization felt really compelled to take part in the recovery effort. We've seen how microfinance could play a really valuable role in the long-term recovery effort following disasters, and that it plays an important part after the relief phase is over and after assets have been replaced and grants have been given. That credit given to women can really help them rebuild their lives.
In 2005, Grameen Foundation began collaborating with Mitra Duafa, a local microfinance institution committed to empowering poor communities through microfinance. Soon, Mitra Duafa opened its first branch in Darussalam, one of the worst affected towns in Banda Aceh. One of Mitra Duafa's first clients from Darussalam was Rahmati. Mitra Duafa reached out to those hardest hit by the catastrophe. They visited temporary shelters, offering loans to those who had nothing.
Kami bilang, mana ada orang tuh percaya sama kita nggak ada duit sama kita udah habis kita makan, kita jual apa mau diambil, beras sama minyak yang ada di rumah, apa diambil nanti.
She and her family lost everything during tsunami and were still coping with the loss of her youngest son. Determined to start over and provide for her family, Rahmati took out her first loan to start a business.
Pinjaman pertama saya ambil untuk bikin modal usaha, untuk bikin kue basah, beli tempat-tempat, beli itu semua, beli gula, beli tepung, beli telur, bikin kue, antar ke gede-gede. Jadi bisa kami tutup untuk Mitra Duafa, bisa untuk jajan untuk anak sekolah, bisa kami tinggal untuk beli barang kami. Mudah-mudahan bisa simpan lah sikit-sikit.
These loans are based on social collateral. The 30 women in Rahmati's group support one another and hold each other accountable. These women share the same tragedy and have faced the same challenges together. Their weekly center meetings, first held in the temporary housing camp where they were all living, created lasting friendships and a support system that sustained them through the most trying times. Now, in her fourth loan cycle, Rahmati has expanded her business. In addition to making and selling pisang sale, a traditional snack of deep-fried bananas, she now buys bottled water wholesale to sell to her neighbors and local shops.
Sampai dari pertama ibu satu tipi nggak ada, sampai ibu udah kayak gini, sampai besar beli tanah lagi.
In 2007, the American Red Cross partnered with Grameen Foundation and Mitra Duafa to expand microcredit throughout Aceh. This support allowed Mitra Duafa to open 6 more branches that will provide tools to more than 18,000 poor women to restart their lives and regain their livelihoods. Dori is a borrower from one of the newly opened branches. The tsunami leveled the small fishing village where she lived. All of her family members survived, but their home and business did not. Last year, Mitra Duafa loaned her money to build up her small business selling kerupuk, a traditional chip. What started as a small family business now employs members of her community, transforming their lives and hers.
Awak aku perlu bertanya, kasi belum digaji kawaknya 8. Nah, awak pasal kerupuk mau tidak, aja. Gaji menurut jam juga.
In the 4 years since Grameen Foundation first partnered with Mitra Duafa, their microfinance services have benefited over 13,000 families in Aceh.
harapan kami dengan progres yang begitu bagus di Aceh sampai dengan saat ini, maka Mitra Duafa bisa berkembang dengan baik dan banyak lagi melayani masyarakat miskin di Aceh.
Grameen Foundation and Mitra Duafa have seen the profound impact of microfinance following a disaster and are committed to providing a better life for the poor tsunami survivors of Aceh.
Okay, so before we dive into workshop, this is Muhammad Yunus. I think it's very important to I guess to know him and know his story. He began his career as a Bengali academic. He was an economist. He was getting his PhD, and most importantly, he had already succeeded as a for-profit entrepreneur. He started a packaging company, and did not really think about social impacts that much in his early years. And then it was in 1976, so well into in his mid-30s, he realized on a visit to a village that there was this lack of loan options to the poorest potential entrepreneurs, but at the same time recognized the innovation and the ideas that people had in these villages, and there was just no options. If you didn't have collateral, banks wouldn't lend to you, and loan sharks did exist in the village if you could somehow secure a relationship with one, but they would charge you 10% interest per week. So if you borrow $1, you owe $128 in a year. So that's how terrible the options were for an individual without any collateral. But like I said, through those local microfinance institutions, local regulatory partners, you can extend those microloans to such individuals who make profit and repay. In that video, they talked about these networks of women that run these local shops and how they're accountable to each other. The success of microfinance has traditionally, I think, been only bolstered by its collectivist roots and this idea of sort of accountability to friend groups or accountability to local communities. I think that's a big part of where everything came from. And then Professor Yunus did win the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006 for his work. So, I think microfinance is important, but at heart, I talk about it, that shouldn't say supply chain, that should say consumers. I talk about it because it's a perfect example of, a business that is just targeted at serving an untapped demographic. And I think the basics behind much, if not all, of entrepreneurial ventures, for-profit or non-profit or social entrepreneurship, is finding an opportunity in a customer and finding something that they aren't able to access right now that they will be able to access as a result of your efforts. Here, it's literally something as simple as a loan. And once Yunus realized that there was this entire base of the pyramid, that's another buzzword in social entrepreneurship, but this base of the pyramid that, if you just did a much, much higher volume of smaller loans, could be a mutually beneficial relationship between, the Grameen Foundation making interest and making, its interest back, and all of these individuals, being able to start up their businesses and elevating themselves in their societies. But it's a different model than existed in traditional banks, so I think it does come with some advantages and disadvantages. So does anybody have any ideas on any of these pillars? I think you could go a lot of different directions with this. This is a big part of the history of social entrepreneurship. But I do think that there are some disadvantages that Yunus had to think through when starting this. So I'll get us kicked off. Or do you have an idea?
Job creation.
Job creation, sure. I mean,
Disadvantage would be high risk.
high risk.
This money may never come back because it's not based on credit score or any
Right.
past credit.
Right. You're trusting people that promise you that they understand risk better than the experts on Wall Street understand risk. That's a pretty risky thing to do. So I would definitely agree with that. Yeah.
Well, economically, the money is getting to the people that need it rather than the people that are reaching out their palms and never people's down.
I like that. So rather than just sort of money going to people that are begging for it, money is being more appropriately managed and going to...
I was really talking about like if our government just gives money to another government, by the time it gets down to the people that are doing the jobs, there's very little money left for them. Whereas if you go directly to an NGO, to a community, and give the money directly to the people that are creating the product, they get 100% of it rather than people along the chain.
And that goes back to our sort of percent hike-ups, but thinking about it the opposite way and thinking of it in terms of, there's a lot of criticism of USAID money and sort of it landing at the top and not getting to where it's supposed to go. Again, another issue for another lecture, but that's a good point. Did you have your hand raised? No. Any other?
There's a human capital angle to it. So far, majority of the loans have gone to women. I don't know if it was planned or it just so happened.
It was planned that way at the beginning, actually. It took them a couple of years to expand into loaning to men.
Yeah, so basically they're empowering women to be independent and support that.
Like that. Yeah. So, I think those are all good comments, and I'll just get through this so we can make sure we cover financing as well. So it is profitable, like I said. That's an amazing recovery rate when you look historically at some of those other financial products I mentioned earlier. And the reason they're able to do that is they diversify. They have like this tiered system. If you have absolutely no money, they'll give you a 0% loan. And depending on how much money you have or what sort of loans you're taking out, they'll make it work for you. Disadvantage, I think, so not to get all venture capital phrasey on you, but the deal flow is necessarily small to start, right? So, the size of the loans means you need to very quickly build out a system of thousands and thousands of people to manage all these small loans. You have high volume, much higher than any bank would ever think it was worth it to loan. There's a reason why banks have a minimum amount of money they'll loan you, because it needs to be worth their time to hire somebody to watch that for you and work with you on that. So, it's a different way of thinking about the model. Social, we mentioned this earlier about opportunity equity and economic advancement. And then environmental, again, there's no way you would have known this, but Grameen, over time, has been able to invest some of its excess profits in environmental health and water sanitation in some of these areas. So, they're giving back to the communities in more ways than one. So, like I alluded to earlier, any good entrepreneur, I think, is always thinking about customers. Who is out there that wants something that they're not getting right now, and how can I deliver it to them? When you think of it from like a social equity perspective or from an environmental, positivity perspective, I think the opportunities are that much better. I do think there are some risks, though, that come with trying to market out to a particular consumer. I think a lot of, and I've seen this happen with entrepreneurs that sometimes get really excited about an idea, particularly nonprofit startups, and they start an organization and they're like, yes, we're going to do this, we're going to solve this problem, we're going to help these people, and I feel so passionate about it. And they don't do an accurate assessment of what's out there, and they invest a lot of resources that maybe instead could have been invested in like partnerships or sort of working with existing programs. I think as a manager, it's just really important to benchmark your passion and your vision against what is out there before you invest time, dollars, hours. Well, I guess time and hours is the same thing. Passion. Same thing, competitive landscape. This all adds up to, I think, something that I would impress on any social entrepreneur if you go bankrupt before you serve your target customers or before you are able to realize your impact, then you're not going to hit any bottom lines. That's just the way it is. So I know financing, I want to make sure we get to this video because I think the financing part is an important facet, and I do want to talk about impact investing. So for a lot of social enterprises, startup capital comes from three sources. You get your government, your foundation, and your private sector. Government capital is often cyclical, often restrictive. You know, you apply for money, you get your money, you have to spend it in a certain way, and then it goes away. Foundation money, and this applies more strongly to nonprofits, although there are opportunities for for-profits. But in addition, you know, same sort of restrictions. Private sector is obviously the most ideal in terms of flexibility and being able to, you know, not confine your money or your spending or your business plan to particular cycles that may or may not be out of your control as it relates to how the marketplace looks. Private funding can be more strategic and long-term, but I think for a social entrepreneur, the problem really is in finding it. So, you know, I like to think of financing opportunities when it comes to social entrepreneurs and this sort of 2x2 matrix, and not just because I was a consultant once upon a time. Like, you know, you got your four spaces. On your x-axis, I think of like the risk for profit, like low risk for profit, like sure things, like you just invented like bread. High risk for profit, maybe you just invented, I don't know, donuts or something that's riskier. And then think about your utility on social impact from high to low, from the point of view of the investor. So if I'm a high utility social impact investor, I love the fact that you're changing the world. I used to, you know, be a hippie in the 60s and 70s, and now I'm like a rich investor, but if you were going to change the world and have a social impact, I am all about it. Low utility, I don't really care. I'm just like I just want to make money. I could care less about whether you're saving the world or not. So you got this profit axis and you got this social impact axis. And so I think the combinations of the two provide a good framework for thinking about financing opportunities. So over here, high risk for profit, your investor doesn't really care about social impact. You'd think that a lot of these would be tossed. I mean, it's just an easy dump. It's a high risk investment. You know, I'm not really going to get anything out of the social impact of this. So why would I even think about it? Over here, you have a low risk for profit, low utility social impact. That's, I think, basically the majority of the venture capital space as it existed. Well, definitely as it existed 10 years ago. My argument is that we're shifting a little bit. But, you know, like social impact doesn't matter. There's a low risk for profit I'm going to invest in here. And most investors are looking for that. They're not even thinking about that y-axis, right? Dream space, you know, investor finds an idea that has a high utility and like really cares about social impact. The idea has low risk for profit. I mean, it's kind of a dream space of sorts. I mean, you don't really see opportunities like that. You don't. It just doesn't really happen. And I think the sweet spot here is this impact space up here, and it's the reality of social entrepreneurial investing, of impact investing. It's risky. Oftentimes, social impact-driven ideas that take into account customers or human capital, or have these different components to the business model, may be a little riskier than somebody that is just bottom line cost minimization, bottom line, just nothing extra having to do with social impact. But there are investors out there that do value this idea of social impact to an extent that maybe they're willing to take a little bit more risk in the profit side. And this would have been not unheard of probably 20 years ago, but these days there are actually houses that, let's see, I'm trying to get to the next slide. I think there's a bit, yeah. But nowadays there are investment houses that actually concentrate on these things. So we're just going to watch. This is a really quick video, like 5 minutes. It's from Forbes, from an impact investing house.
We've heard a lot about impact investing. What does that actually mean?
Impact investing is a very simple idea. It's the simple idea that an investment can not only seek financial returns as most investments do, but also seek to solve social and environmental problems. That is either a really obvious idea or it's an incredibly radical idea. It's obvious because many of us know that when we make investments in healthcare or in education or in low-income housing, those investments can help address social problems. But it's also a radical idea because many people still cling to the belief that the only purpose of investing should be to make money, and that if we want to solve social problems, we should just use charity and we should just be giving our money away. Impact investing is a new idea for those people because it really pushes forward the idea that investing can be alongside government and philanthropy, a tool we can use to solve social problems.
We're talking about companies that actually, through their goods and services, are providing some sort of social good. It's not this old model of we make a lot of money, we give a little bit to good causes, and we tell the world about that because that makes us look good. It's something different than that.
Right. So it's that and more. It's basically saying that we shouldn't be limited to grants as the key tool that we use, but rather one of a number of tools that could include below market rate loans, investments into higher risk areas that a traditional market rate investor might not explore, and a whole host of areas of engagement with organizations that are nonprofit or for-profit, but are really about impact.
Unlike a company like Ben & Jerry's that produce a product and then use some of those profits to support communities, impact investors are looking at companies that are, through the company itself and the products that they sell and the customers they sell to, are addressing social problems. So for instance, it's investors who are lending to private schools that are very affordable in the slums of India that are helping to close the educational gap. Or it's investors who are giving loans to farmers in rural Africa who take those loans and allow them to participate in much more lucrative international export opportunities versus local opportunities.
In the space of impact investing and social entrepreneurship and all the areas that you've come across, what is actually working right now, and what should we all be a little bit skeptical of?
In the book, we talk about one of the problems in this sector of premature celebration-itis.
Sure.
We tend to get very excited about announcements of new ideas and don't necessarily follow up and look at what actually worked. And I think, to your point, not to get too technical, but the idea that somehow impact investing can replace government or replace charity, when you look down at the deal-by-deal basis, proves to be a little bit false. In reality, some of the most exciting deals that are both generating substantial social impact and also making money for investors are one in which the investors and the entrepreneurs work in very interesting ways alongside government and philanthropy. So I think one thing that works, and we see this time and again, is when the impact investors and the social entrepreneurs recognize that they don't exist outside of government systems and philanthropic systems, but are able to partner them together.
Let's say I'm a newly minted millionaire, multi-millionaire, millionaire, and I'm just starting to think about giving away my money, making some sort of impact in the world. What would you say to me? I don't want to just write a check to some organization. I want to use the same business principles that I use to accumulate my wealth to create some kind of impact. What would be my first step?
Well, I think the first step is to really re-engage with those things about which you're most passionate, whether it's the environment or arts or education or any of these areas. And then to understand, as you're thinking about what to do in that area, that the tools that you have available to advance the interests of that theme, if you will, really go well beyond what you could do on a charitable basis. And so maybe your first step would be to do as Bill Gates did and simply spend a year or two learning about what the real critical issues are in that space, what the current practices are, and to do that through the lens of impact, and to be looking for what are those opportunities where you could perhaps leverage more of a free enterprise market orientation to the solution in addition to what you may decide to do on a charitable basis.
Gary. Acumen's actually New York based, but they do some of this stuff too. There are a number of houses out there that are actually very, very interested in investing in things that meet certain social impact metrics depending on the organization. So it's not just sort of like a dream, like of, you know, maybe there's some crazy person out there that will invest in me. There are people that will look at that, and it is an option. But at the same time, I think the quandary for the entrepreneur lies in the very basic fact that when you're at a stage where you just need someone to invest in you, you kind of just need dollars. You're human, you know. So with that, you know, the deep quandary as a socially conscious entrepreneur, I think can sometimes come down to, you know, financing and, you know, really deciding on company policy and values and mission. You know, there are certain principled entrepreneurs, they're kind of out there. They're kids I knew in business school, well, people I know in business school. But, you know, they're just very, very picky about who invests in their enterprises. And, like, they want to know that any given portfolio that they're affiliated with doesn't have vice companies in it and things like that. You know, do they only have to fund triple bottom line companies, or can that be part of a larger portfolio? And, you know, when you get to that stage of financing as an entrepreneur, as somebody looking for somebody to support and make your initiative sustainable, I think that's just kind of a leadership question and a management question that it's each individual's onus to kind of decide for themselves. I do think that, like it says at the bottom here, there really is never a better opportunity to brand a business as benefiting a society than at its beginning, though. So, you know, deciding on those values, deciding on what it is that makes your product or your service or your patent, you know, part of sort of a larger company behind it, or, you know, basically, you know, what is it that drives what you guys are about, and how can you think about social impact when framing out bringing something to market beyond just, I want to bring it to market and make some dollars. Like, how do you want to measure your impact? That's like a whole nother question. You know, measurement is very relative, and there's a lot of different ways to do it depending on the sector that you're working in. But I do think that, you know, making money is hard without thinking about social impact. So social entrepreneurship is only that much harder than regular entrepreneurship. But I do think that there are some things in today's marketplace that are advantageous for the social entrepreneur. I think the age of sustainability is upon us. We were talking about the evolution of LEED. I mentioned, you know, sort of the myriad of certification systems and metrics that are out there. And I think all of that is driving towards a more legitimized view of what it is to do business in the world. And it really has to do with social impact these days. And you're seeing that not only in these certifications, you're seeing that in the evolution of, you know, corporate entities. Maryland, for example, is the first state in the country to have established a legal identity for a corporation that wants to put some of its funding into social impact initiatives. It's called a benefit corporation. It's a spin-off of this initiative by this organization called B Corps Lab. And actually, University of Maryland graduate students just presented in Annapolis a week ago about the state of the evolution of Maryland's benefit corporation law. And, you know, how it's great that this state, of all states, is a first mover in establishing the importance of thinking of non-traditional ways to approach business. And by non-traditional, I mean non-traditional in juxtaposition to maybe like University of Chicago economics or the way people looked at profitability in the 1970s. We're in a new world today, and I think there is a wide open space for any entrepreneur to be socially minded and to have a social impact. And then just one last quick plug, if you're interested in social entrepreneurship, we're having our annual Social Enterprise Symposium at STAMP on March 1st, 2013. The registration link is there. We'll have a number of panels and different social entrepreneurs coming in and speaking. The Director of Environmental Sustainability for Cliff Bar is our opening keynote. And then if you apply for our social impact pitch competition and you're a finalist, you'll be competing there. The CEO of the Calvert Foundation, the CEO of Carbon War Room, and a third person whose name I cannot remember right now will be the judges for that competition. So, yeah, great place to continue learning more if this piqued your interest. But thank you so much for your time, and have a great day.